Imagine this, it's a bright, sunny afternoon, and the streets are alive with the buzz of the city. Among the crowd, a woman steps out of her sleek black car, her presence commanding attention. She's immaculately dressed, exuding confidence with every step. Her designer handbag swings lightly at her side, and her shoes click purposefully on the pavement. This is a woman who's worked hard, overcome barriers, and built a life of success and comfort. Her name doesn't matter right now, what matters is her story. As she approaches a highly rated, upscale restaurant, she feels a mix of excitement and anticipation. It's a place known for its exclusivity, its refined menu, and its promise of an exceptional dining experience. She'd chosen it carefully, wanting to treat herself after closing a major deal that took months of tireless effort. She imagined savoring every bite of a meal that matched her sense of accomplishment. But as she reached for the door, something unexpected happened. The hostess, standing behind the polished wooden podium, glanced up briefly before looking away. It was a moment, a flicker of something hard to describe. Dismissal? Hesitation? Whatever it was, it didn't sit right. The woman adjusted her posture, her confidence unwavering, and stepped inside. The lobby was exactly as she imagined. Chandeliers glittered overhead, soft music floated in the air, and the aroma of freshly prepared dishes hinted at the culinary delights to come. "Good afternoon," she said with a warm smile, meeting the hostess's eyes directly. "I have a reservation." The hostess blinked, then her lips tightened into a thin line. She scanned the reservation list quickly, too quickly, and then looked up. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone brisk and uninviting. "We're fully booked today." The woman frowned. "That can't be right. I booked a table last week, and I received a confirmation just yesterday." There was a pause. A long, uncomfortable pause. The kind that makes you acutely aware of every sound around you, the clinking of glasses, the hushed laughter from nearby tables. It was as though time itself slowed down, forcing her to take in every detail of the hostess's expression. Her gaze, her body language, they all said more than her words ever could. "We must have made an error," the hostess finally said, her voice lacking the warmth or regret you'd expect from someone delivering bad news. "I'm really sorry, but we can't accommodate you today." It wasn't the words that stung the most, it was how they were said. No apology. No effort to offer an alternative. Just a curt dismissal, as if her presence there was somehow inconvenient. As if she didn't belong. The woman's heart sank, but she wasn't someone who gave up easily. She stood her ground, pulling up the confirmation email on her phone and showing it to the hostess. "This clearly states I have a reservation for 1 p.m. Can you double-check, please?" The hostess hesitated, her eyes darting around nervously. It was clear she hadn't expected this level of assertiveness. Finally, she sighed and stepped away to consult a manager. As the woman waited, she couldn't help but notice the way other diners looked at her, some with curiosity, others with something she could only describe as pity. It was as though they, too, understood that something wasn't quite right. When the manager arrived, he didn't even glance at the reservation system before turning to the woman with an apologetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience," he began, "but unfortunately, we're unable to seat you today. It seems there was a mix-up with the booking." Her chest tightened. A mix-up? Or something else entirely? She glanced around the room, taking in the faces of the diners, none of whom looked like her. The realization hit her like a cold wave. This wasn't about a reservation. It wasn't about a mix-up. This was something deeper, something uglier. But rather than walk away defeated, she made a decision. If this establishment wasn't going to treat her with respect, she was going to make sure the world knew about it. What happens next is a story you won't believe, one filled with unexpected twists, an act of courage, and an outcome that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about fairness, respect, and the power of standing up for what's right. The woman stood there, her polished demeanor concealing the storm of emotions brewing inside her. She wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but this situation was starting to feel all too familiar. Growing up, she'd faced moments like this, subtle but unmistakable slights that whispered, "You're not welcome here." Back then, she'd been taught to stay composed, to never let anyone see they'd rattled her. And now, after years of hard work and undeniable success, she found herself in the same uncomfortable position. But this time, she wasn't a shy girl hoping not to make waves. She was a self-assured woman who'd earned her place in any room, including this one. Still, she could feel her heart racing as the seconds ticked by. The manager stood there, his polite but hollow smile unyielding, and the hostess shifted awkwardly behind the podium, clearly eager to move on. "Let me be clear," the woman said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm not here to argue. I made a reservation, I received confirmation, and I expect to be seated like any other paying guest." The manager's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "I completely understand your frustration, ma'am. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do at the moment. If you'd like, we'd be happy to accommodate you another time." Another time? The audacity of that suggestion made her blood boil. Did they really think she'd come back after this? And yet, she knew that raising her voice or causing a scene wouldn't get her anywhere. People were already watching, their curious eyes darting between her and the staff. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the way they were waiting to see how she'd handle the situation. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, she made a decision. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out of the restaurant, her head held high. It wasn't defeat, far from it. This was strategy. She knew that power often came from knowing when to disengage and when to strike. And this wasn't over. As she stepped back into the sunlight, she felt the warmth on her skin and let it steady her. She wasn't just going to let this slide. She had options, and she planned to use every single one of them. But first, she needed to process what had just happened. Was it truly a simple mistake? Or was there something more sinister at play? Later that evening, she sat in her living room, her phone resting on the coffee table in front of her. She'd spent the last few hours reflecting on the day, replaying every moment in her mind. The way the hostess had barely looked at her. The nervous energy that filled the air when she'd insisted on her reservation. The manager's overly polite but dismissive tone. It all painted a picture that was hard to ignore. This wasn't the first time she'd faced discrimination, and sadly, she knew it likely wouldn't be the last. But what made this situation different was her platform. Over the years, she'd built a name for herself, not just in her career but as a voice for those who often went unheard. She'd spoken out against injustices before, but this one hit particularly close to home. This wasn't just about her, it was about what this moment represented for so many others who'd experienced similar treatment. She picked up her phone and began typing. At first, it was just for herself, a way to organize her thoughts and feelings. But as the words flowed, she realized she had something to say that needed to be heard. She crafted a post, careful to stick to the facts and avoid anything that could be misconstrued. "Today, I experienced something that left me deeply unsettled," she wrote. "I went to a well-known restaurant where I'd made a reservation days in advance. Upon arriving, I was told there was no record of my booking and that the restaurant was fully booked. The way the situation was handled made me question whether this was truly an error or something more troubling. I've worked hard to build a life where I can enjoy experiences like this without second-guessing whether I belong. But moments like today remind me that the fight for fairness and respect isn't over." She paused, reading the words over before continuing. "I'm sharing this not for sympathy, but because I know I'm not alone in this experience. Too often, subtle acts of exclusion go unspoken, and the people responsible face no accountability. It's time we shed light on these moments, not with anger but with determination to create change." With one final glance at her post, she hit share and set her phone down. What happened next was beyond anything she could have anticipated. Within minutes, the post began to gain traction. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers started commenting, offering words of support, and sharing their own similar stories. Some people were outraged, demanding to know the name of the restaurant. Others encouraged her to take action, suggesting she reach out to the management directly or even consider legal options. As the hours passed, the post continued to spread, eventually catching the attention of local media outlets. Journalists reached out, asking for interviews, while others began investigating the restaurant's history. Had this happened before? Were there patterns of similar complaints? The answers to those questions would soon come to light, but for now, the focus remained on her story and the questions it raised about accountability, bias, and the importance of speaking out. The woman watched it all unfold with a mix of emotions. She hadn't anticipated this level of response, but she welcomed it. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about shining a light on an issue that affected countless others. Still, she knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be backlash, accusations, and people who tried to discredit her. But she was ready for it. She had to be. Because this wasn't just a fight for her dignity, it was a fight for something much bigger. And so, with a sense of purpose and a growing resolve, she prepared for what was to come. Whatever the truth behind that day's events, she was determined to uncover it and ensure that no one else had to experience the same. But what she didn't know was just how far-reaching the impact of her actions would be, or how many lives her story would touch in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The following morning, the woman woke to the sound of her phone buzzing relentlessly. Groggy and still half asleep, she reached for it, her screen lighting up with an overwhelming number of notifications. Her post had taken on a life of its own overnight, drawing attention far beyond her immediate circle. There were messages of encouragement, solidarity, and outrage from strangers. But as she scrolled, she also noticed the inevitable wave of skepticism and backlash. Some comments were harsh, accusing her of exaggerating or playing the victim. Others dismissed her experience entirely, suggesting it was simply a misunderstanding and nothing more. She felt a pang of frustration as she read these words. It was easy for people to deny or downplay something they hadn't lived through themselves. But instead of letting it discourage her, she reminded herself why she'd shared her story in the first place. Later that day, she received a call from a journalist who worked for a popular online publication. They wanted to feature her story in an article about discrimination in the service industry. At first, she hesitated. Did she really want to relive the experience, to open herself up to even more scrutiny? But then she thought about all the messages she'd received from others who'd been through similar situations. This wasn't just her story anymore, it was theirs too. The journalist, a young woman with a soft but determined voice, asked thoughtful questions, taking care to ensure the story was told with nuance and respect. The woman recounted every detail she could remember: the subtle shift in the hostess's demeanor, the manager's dismissive attitude, the sinking feeling that told her this wasn't just a mistake. When the article was published later that week, it struck a chord with readers across the country. It wasn't just about her, it was about a system that allowed subtle acts of exclusion to go unchecked. As the story gained traction, new layers of complexity began to emerge. A former employee of the restaurant reached out anonymously, claiming they'd witnessed similar incidents during their time working there. According to this source, certain patrons were sometimes treated differently based on their appearance, though it was never explicitly stated. The woman couldn't say she was surprised, but hearing it confirmed added a new level of clarity and urgency to her mission. Meanwhile, the restaurant's management issued a carefully worded statement, insisting that they valued diversity and inclusion and that the incident in question was purely a misunderstanding. They stopped short of apologizing directly, instead offering vague promises to review their practices. To some, this response might have been enough, but to the woman, it felt like an empty gesture, one designed to quiet the noise rather than address the root of the problem. Behind the scenes, she began working with a local advocacy group that focused on combating discrimination in public spaces. Together, they brainstormed ways to bring about meaningful change, from public awareness campaigns to training programs for hospitality staff. The woman felt a renewed sense of purpose as she channeled her frustration into action. She wasn't just speaking out for herself, she was fighting for a future where no one else would have to endure what she had. But as the movement grew, so did the resistance. Online trolls began targeting her, twisting her words and attacking her character. Some dug into her past, searching for anything they could use against her. It was exhausting and disheartening, but she refused to let it silence her. She'd faced bigger challenges before, and she wasn't about to back down now. Amid all this, a surprising subplot began to unfold. A small but vocal group of loyal customers began to boycott the restaurant, sharing their own stories of questionable treatment and demanding accountability. Social media became a battleground, with people on both sides debating the issue. Some argued that the woman was overreacting, while others saw her as a catalyst for much-needed change. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table scrolling through the latest updates, her phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. On the other end was a young woman who introduced herself as the hostess from that fateful day. Her voice trembled as she explained why she was reaching out. "I need to tell you something," she said, her words rushed and tinged with regret. "I've been feeling awful about what happened, and I think you deserve to know the truth." The hostess admitted that she'd been instructed by her supervisor to deny the woman's service, though she hadn't been given a clear reason why. "I didn't agree with it," she said, her voice cracking. "But I was scared to say anything. I needed the job, and I didn't know what else to do." Hearing this, the woman felt a mix of emotions: vindication, anger, sadness. She thanked the hostess for her honesty and assured her that speaking up was the right thing to do. After hanging up, she sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the revelation sinking in. This wasn't just about her experience, it was about a culture of exclusion that needed to be dismantled. As the days turned into weeks, the conflict continued to escalate. The restaurant faced mounting pressure to address the allegations, while the woman found herself at the center of a larger conversation about equality and respect. She knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but she also knew she wasn't alone. Every message of support, every story shared, every step toward change reminded her why she'd started this fight in the first place. And yet, despite all the progress, the true resolution still felt out of reach. There were questions left unanswered, battles left to fight, and truths left to uncover. The woman braced herself for what was to come, knowing that the journey was far from over. But if there was one thing she'd learned, it was this: real change doesn't happen overnight. It takes courage, persistence, and a refusal to accept the status quo. And she was ready for it all. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The woman's story had gone beyond her wildest expectations, sparking conversations that reached far beyond her city. It wasn't just about one restaurant anymore, it was about what that moment represented: a deeper, systemic issue that resonated with countless people. Social media platforms were ablaze with debates, and news outlets continued to pick up the story. Every time she thought the attention might start to fade, something new would reignite it. She felt the weight of it all, the way her words and actions were scrutinized by supporters and critics alike. Some called her a hero, someone who stood up when many others might have stayed silent. Others painted her as a troublemaker, accusing her of stirring up unnecessary controversy for attention. It was exhausting, and there were nights when the weight of it all felt almost unbearable. But then she would read a message from someone who had found courage in her story, and it reminded her why she couldn't stop now. Behind the scenes, the pressure on the restaurant continued to mount. The revelation from the former hostess had only added fuel to the fire. The restaurant had doubled down on its denials, insisting that the incident was a misunderstanding and that their policies were fair and unbiased. They brought in a public relations firm to manage the growing crisis, and their tone shifted from defensive to conciliatory. They announced plans for staff diversity training and pledged to conduct an internal review. But to the woman and many others, it felt like too little, too late. Their actions seemed less about genuine change and more about damage control. Then came the breaking point. One morning, the woman woke up to find that a high-profile figure, a prominent civil rights attorney, had publicly offered to represent her. He had seen her story and believed it was more than just an isolated incident. He wanted to dig deeper, to find out if this was part of a pattern. It wasn't about money or even a legal battle, it was about holding people accountable. The woman hesitated at first. She hadn't set out to take legal action, but the attorney's passion was undeniable, and his track record spoke for itself. If there was a way to turn this moment into lasting change, she owed it to herself and others to consider it. As they began working together, more pieces of the puzzle started to emerge. The attorney's team uncovered complaints from other patrons who had experienced similar treatment at the restaurant. While some stories were subtle and harder to prove, others were blatant and undeniable. Former employees came forward, sharing accounts of discriminatory practices behind the scenes. Slowly but surely, a clearer picture began to take shape. The restaurant, meanwhile, was in full damage control mode. They organized a press conference, during which the owner made a statement. He expressed regret for any misunderstandings and reiterated his commitment to diversity and inclusion. But he stopped short of taking responsibility for what had happened, instead framing it as an unfortunate coincidence. The woman watched the press conference from her living room, her jaw tightening with every word. It was the kind of non-apology she'd come to expect, and it only strengthened her resolve. Public opinion was divided. Some people praised the restaurant for addressing the issue and attempting to move forward, while others saw through the carefully crafted statements. Protests began to form outside the establishment, with supporters holding signs that read messages like "Accountability matters" and "We won't be silent." The woman was grateful for the support, but she also knew that the real battle wasn't in the streets, it was in the systems that allowed these injustices to persist. One evening, she received another call from an unexpected source. This time, it was a man who introduced himself as a former manager of the restaurant. His voice was steady but tinged with guilt. He admitted that during his time there, he had witnessed and even been complicit in discriminatory practices. "It's not something I'm proud of," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I think you should know the truth. This wasn't just about your reservation. There's a history here, and it goes deeper than you realize." The man went on to explain how the restaurant had quietly implemented unwritten policies to maintain its image. While they never outright said it, it was clear that certain types of customers were less desirable than others. "It was always subtle," he said. "But if you paid attention, it was impossible to ignore." The woman felt a chill run down her spine as she listened. She thanked him for his honesty, but after hanging up, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the tip of the iceberg. If this restaurant had these practices, how many others operated the same way? And how many people had been turned away, dismissed, or made to feel unwelcome without ever realizing why? As the investigation deepened, so did the tension. The restaurant's loyal customers began to push back, accusing the woman and her supporters of trying to ruin a beloved institution. Heated exchanges erupted online and in the media, with some questioning whether the scrutiny was fair. The woman stayed quiet during this time, letting the facts speak for themselves. But inside, she felt the pressure building. The truth was close, she could feel it. But what would happen when it finally came to light? The day of the attorney's final findings was fast approaching, and the woman knew that everything was about to come to a head. She had no idea what the outcome would be, but one thing was certain: this moment would change everything. Whether it ended in resolution or more questions, she was ready to face it head on. The stakes had never been higher, and the world was watching. As the day of the attorney's findings approached, the tension was almost unbearable. The woman found herself checking her phone constantly, watching for updates, even as she tried to carry on with her daily routine. But there was an undercurrent of something else, an uneasiness she couldn't quite shake. The investigation had stirred up so much, and while she was determined to see it through, the weight of the unknown loomed heavy over her. Then, 2 days before the findings were to be released, an unexpected development took everyone by surprise. A video surfaced online, grainy but clear enough to send shockwaves through the conversation. It appeared to show a meeting in the restaurant's back office, with a manager discussing what seemed to be an unspoken policy of exclusion. The audio wasn't perfect, but snippets of the conversation were damning. Words like keeping the right kind of atmosphere and avoiding certain clientele were unmistakable. The video was posted anonymously, and while its authenticity was immediately questioned, it spread like wildfire. Social media erupted as people dissected every frame, debating whether it was real and what it meant if it was. Some called it the smoking gun that would finally expose the restaurant's practices. Others dismissed it as a fabrication meant to tarnish the business's reputation. For the woman, it was both shocking and validating, though it also raised new questions. Who had filmed it? And why now? The attorney's team quickly began working to verify the video's authenticity. The process would take time, but the woman knew that the mere existence of the footage had already changed the game. The restaurant, for its part, immediately went on the defensive. They issued a statement calling the video a malicious attempt to undermine our business and threatened legal action against anyone spreading it. But the damage was done. People were talking, and the story had taken on a new life. As the investigation continued, another twist emerged, one that no one saw coming. A well-known food critic, who had been a regular at the restaurant for years, came forward with his own story. In a heartfelt blog post, he recounted an experience from several years prior when he noticed a group of diners being turned away under suspicious circumstances. At the time, he brushed it off, assuming it was a one-off incident. But in light of the current events, he couldn't stay silent any longer. The food critic's revelation added fuel to the fire. His credibility and reputation made it harder for skeptics to dismiss the claims, and his account mirrored what others had experienced. The woman read his post with a mix of gratitude and sadness. It was comforting to know that others were stepping forward, but it was also a stark reminder of how long this behavior had likely been going on, unchecked and unchallenged. Meanwhile, the woman's personal life was beginning to feel the strain of the ordeal. Friends and family were supportive, but they worried about the toll it was taking on her. The online attacks had intensified, and even though she tried not to let them affect her, there were moments when it all felt overwhelming. But every time she considered stepping back, she thought about the countless people who had reached out to her, sharing their own stories of exclusion and bias. She couldn't walk away, not now, not when the truth was so close. Late one night, as she sat at her desk reviewing notes from the attorney's team, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from the same anonymous source who had posted the video. The message was cryptic but urgent. "There's more you need to see. Meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the coffee shop on Main Street. Come alone." Her heart raced as she read the words. She didn't know whether to feel excited or wary. Who was this person, and why were they reaching out to her directly? Part of her wanted to ignore the message. It could be a trap, or worse, a distraction from the larger fight. But another part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this might be important. If there was more evidence out there, she needed to know. The next morning, she arrived at the coffee shop early, her nerves on edge. She scanned the room, unsure of who she was looking for. A man in his early 40s approached her, his expression serious but not unfriendly. He introduced himself quietly and gestured for her to follow him to a corner table. "I don't have much time," he said, lowering his voice. "But you need to know what you're up against. He pulled out a small USB drive and slid it across the table. This has everything. Emails, memos, internal communications. It's worse than you think. The woman stared at the drive, her pulse quickening. Why are you giving this to me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. Because I worked there for years, and I saw things I wish I hadn't. I stayed quiet because I needed the paycheck, but after seeing what you've done, I can't keep quiet anymore. Before she could ask anything else, he stood up and walked away, leaving her sitting there with the drive in her hand. She felt a mix of gratitude and trepidation. Whatever was on that drive could change everything, but it could also escalate the conflict to a level she wasn't sure she was ready for. That night, the attorney's team analyzed the contents of the drive. As the files were opened, it became clear that this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The emails revealed a deliberate, calculated effort to enforce discriminatory practices, all under the guise of maintaining the restaurant's brand. There were directives from higher-ups, notes about certain customers being off-brand, and even an internal document outlining ways to politely decline reservations without raising suspicion. The woman sat in stunned silence as the evidence was laid out before her. This wasn't just about one incident or one restaurant, it was about a system that had been carefully crafted to exclude people like her, all while maintaining the appearance of inclusivity. And now, with the truth in her hands, she knew there was no turning back. The stakes had never been higher, and the world was watching more closely than ever. The tension in the room was palpable as the attorney's team prepared to reveal the findings to the public. The woman sat quietly, clutching a copy of the documents that had been carefully compiled from the USB drive. She felt a swirl of emotions: nervousness, anger, but also a sense of determination. This was the moment everything had been leading to. The truth would finally come to light, and there was no going back. The press conference was packed. Cameras lined the back of the room, journalists jotted notes, and a small crowd of supporters stood near the entrance, holding signs of encouragement. The attorney began by recounting the initial incident, painting a clear picture of what had transpired and how it fit into a larger pattern. He laid out the evidence methodically, presenting emails, memos, and testimonies that left little room for doubt. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of deliberate exclusionary practices, carefully hidden behind polished branding and vague policies. When the attorney revealed the internal directive labeled Customer Retention Guidelines, a collective gasp rippled through the room. The document, written in neutral corporate language, outlined strategies for avoiding certain demographics while maintaining plausible deniability. Phrases like subtle discouragement tactics and prioritize brand-aligned clientele were impossible to misinterpret. The woman watched the crowd closely as the weight of the revelation sank in. She could see the shock, the anger, and in some faces, a flicker of recognition. As questions from reporters began to pour in, the restaurant's spokesperson issued a statement denying the authenticity of the documents and accusing the woman and her team of fabricating evidence. The woman's stomach churned at the blatant dismissal, but the attorney was ready. He presented verification from multiple sources, including former employees, ensuring that every claim was substantiated. By the end of the presentation, the room was buzzing, the tide clearly turning. But just as the woman began to feel a glimmer of relief, a reporter stood and asked a question that caught everyone off guard. "Are you aware of the restaurant's connection to larger corporate entities?" the reporter asked. The attorney looked puzzled, and the woman felt her heart skip a beat. The reporter continued, explaining that the restaurant was part of a chain owned by a powerful hospitality group with a history of quiet settlements and buried scandals. The woman's mind raced as she processed this revelation. She had been so focused on this one restaurant, this one experience, that she hadn't considered the possibility of a broader network behind it. The stakes, it seemed, were even higher than she'd imagined. If this wasn't an isolated case, how many other places were operating under the same unspoken rules? The twist sent the story into overdrive. The press conference ended with more questions than answers, and the woman found herself at the center of an even bigger storm. Within hours, investigative journalists began digging into the hospitality group's practices, uncovering a trail of complaints and lawsuits that had been quietly swept under the rug. The woman felt both vindicated and overwhelmed. What started as her personal fight had become a nationwide reckoning, and the weight of it was almost too much to bear. But then, something unexpected happened. A representative from the hospitality group reached out to her attorney, requesting a private meeting. At first, she was hesitant. Why would they want to meet now, after denying and deflecting for so long? But the attorney advised her to hear them out. It could be an opportunity to push for real change. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room, far removed from the chaos of the public eye. The representatives were calm, polished, and clearly prepared. They offered an apology, not the vague, corporate kind she'd heard before, but a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing. They admitted that mistakes had been made, not just at the restaurant but across their network, and they proposed a partnership to implement sweeping changes. The woman listened carefully, her emotions mixed. On one hand, this was exactly what she'd been fighting for: accountability and change. On the other hand, she couldn't help but wonder if their offer was just another attempt to protect their image. The attorney stepped in, negotiating terms that ensured transparency and oversight. By the end of the meeting, an agreement was reached. The hospitality group would fund initiatives to combat discrimination in the service industry, provide reparations to those affected, and publicly commit to overhauling their policies. As she walked out of the building, the woman felt an odd mix of relief and uncertainty. The battle she fought so hard to win was over, but the war for equality and fairness was far from finished. And then, just as she thought the story had reached its conclusion, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from the anonymous source who had provided the USB drive. "Check your email," the message read. "There's more you need to know." Her heart raced as she opened her inbox, finding a file labeled "For Your Eyes Only." Inside was a trove of documents revealing similar practices at other restaurants, not just within the hospitality group but across the industry. The implications were staggering. What she had thought was an isolated fight was just the beginning of a much larger battle. She stared at the screen, the weight of the truth sinking in. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The email sat open on her screen, the files staring back at her like a challenge. For a moment, the woman just sat there, overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. She had thought her journey would end with accountability at the restaurant where it all began, but now she saw the deeper layers. This wasn't just about her, or even about one chain of restaurants. This was systemic, a web of silent policies and unspoken rules that stretched far wider than she could have imagined. She forwarded the files to her attorney immediately, not trusting herself to fully process what she was seeing. "We need to discuss this," she wrote in the email. She couldn't carry this weight alone anymore. The attorney called her within the hour, his voice calm but tinged with urgency. "This is explosive," he said. "But it's also delicate. If we push too hard too quickly, the system could push back in ways we're not prepared for." They decided to take a step back and strategize. The immediate battle with the restaurant and the hospitality group had ended in a victory, an imperfect one, but a victory nonetheless. Now they had to figure out how to take on something so much bigger without losing momentum or focus. The woman agreed, though it was hard to temper her growing frustration. She wanted to act, to make the world see what she now saw so clearly. But she also knew the importance of moving thoughtfully. In the weeks that followed, the files became the foundation for something greater. The woman, her attorney, and a growing team of advocates began to build a case not just against individual businesses, but against the broader culture of discrimination in the service industry. They partnered with organizations that had been fighting similar battles for years, pooling resources and stories. Slowly, A picture began to form, one that was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the woman's personal life finally began to settle. The initial storm of media attention had died down, leaving her with a strange kind of quiet. Her friends and family were there for her, grounding her when the weight of her fight threatened to pull her under. She spent her days working with the advocacy team and her nights reflecting on how far she had come. There were moments when she doubted herself, wondering if she had the strength to keep going. But then she would think of all the messages she had received from strangers, each one a reminder that her fight was about so much more than her own experience. The hospitality group, true to their word, began implementing the changes they had promised. They held public forums, updated their policies, and donated to initiatives aimed at addressing discrimination in the service industry. It wasn't enough to undo the harm they had caused, but it was a start. The woman attended one of the forums, sitting quietly in the back as people shared their experiences. She was moved by their stories, each one a testament to the resilience of those who had been made to feel less than. But even as progress was made, the woman couldn't ignore the looming presence of the files she had received. They were a constant reminder that her fight was far from over. With the help of her attorney, she began reaching out to some of the individuals mentioned in the documents. Many were hesitant, afraid of the consequences of speaking out. But others were ready, their anger and frustration outweighing their fear. Slowly, a coalition began to form a network of people united by a shared desire for justice. One day, as she was preparing for a meeting, the woman received a call from an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering, unsure of what to expect. On the other end of the line was a journalist who had been following her story closely. "I've been digging into this," the journalist said, their voice steady but urgent. "And I think you should know you've already made an impact. Other businesses are starting to change their policies because of what you've done. They don't want to be the next ones exposed." The woman felt a wave of emotion wash over her. It was a small victory, but it reminded her why she had started this fight in the first place. Change was slow, sometimes painfully so, but it was happening. And she had played a part in making it happen. Months turned into a year, and the woman's story continued to evolve. She became a voice for others, using her platform to amplify the stories of those who had been silenced for too long. She spoke at conferences, participated in panel discussions, and even contributed to a documentary about systemic discrimination in the service industry. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was one she had grown to embrace. The files she had received that day in the coffee shop eventually became the basis for a sweeping investigation that reached the highest levels of the industry. It led to new regulations, increased transparency, and a renewed focus on accountability. The woman knew the fight wasn't over, there would always be more work to do. But she also knew that change was possible, and that knowledge gave her hope. Looking back, the woman couldn't believe how much had changed since that fateful night at the restaurant. What had started as a moment of frustration and hurt had grown into something she could never have imagined. She had faced challenges she never thought she could overcome and discovered strength she didn't know she had. And while the journey had been far from easy, she wouldn't have traded it for anything. In the end, the woman realized that her fight wasn't just about her own experience. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, who had been told they didn't belong. It was about creating a world where those moments of exclusion and hurt became a thing of the past. And as she stood on that stage, speaking to a room full of people who believed in that vision, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.